I was married to Nell Seaton, who lays here in rest. I came from Sweden in 1894 and met my husband, Nels, in 1899. Nels Seaton came over when he was 16 years old. From Sweden, on the ships, he went into England first, sailed over to New York. From New York, he came to Missoula. Miner. He was a miner. Young man. Very young man. I met him and I thought, what a strapping young man that is. I think I'll marry him. I'm more commonly known as Lena, not Carolina. In Sweden, I was Carolina. Hello, Lay, hello. You guys were all down there talking to my children. Yes.
They told me to come see you.
Yes. Well, I'm Carolina, John's daughter, Linderman Seaton.
Okay.
More commonly known as Lena Seaton. I was married to Nels Seaton. And I came from Sweden, as did Nels. Nels came when he was 16 years old on the ship sailing over. Took him about a month to get to America. His dream was come to America, as so many were back then. And he did, and he was a miner. Our wedding picture's there on the board. And then, as you can see, the years went by. We had our family. We married in Mullen, Idaho, had 6 children. Some of them were born up in Garnet, which is where he ultimately settled. We settled up there, and he was a miner. We had 6 of our children. As you saw down below, 2 of them died tragically, both Tor and Margaret. And our life went on. We were happy to raise family in America. Nels died in 1939, and as you saw down below, Margaret had died in 1937, and Tor, who had just completed school, died, and he was going to go on to the Butte School of Mines and further his education. But he got killed in a mining accident just the day before he was to start school at the School of Mines. So life went on for us, and we stayed there. My grandpa, or my husband, sorry, I've not done this before. Nels became the postmaster up in Garnet. And our life became better. We moved into a 2-bedroom cabin instead of a 1-bedroom. And we had a place for Margaret, who had spina bifida, to have her own little room and her own bed. So we stayed there until Nils died, and then I was taken to Butte to be with one of my sons there. So that's kind of the story of the Seaton family. Actually, in actuality, Nels Seaton is my grandpa. So I knew him well. And that's how I know the story of the Seaton family. This is our first time of doing this, and I've always wanted to participate in it, the Stones and Stories. I guess everybody's from Missoula here, except us. So life is good, and we enjoy being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
This is my great-grandfather. Any rate, John B. mustered out of the Civil War in the Illinois Regiment, returned to Illinois, single fellow, 27 years old or so, and was bored stiff. So, as most young men had a tendency to do, he went west. And he had a friend with him, and the two of them palled around together, and they got word that there was a gentleman bringing a large covered wagon train and a large herd of cattle coming up from Texas, bringing the cattle into Montana. And they also got word that this gentleman, his name was Nelson Story, he was looking for guards because they were about to enter hostile Indian territory and they felt they needed more protection than just the cowboys taking care of the cattle. The two of them hired on. All went reasonably well. They did have one little skirmish where they had to go steal back the cattle that the Indians had taken, which they did successfully. At any rate, they got up to a place called Fort Phil Kearny. I don't know where that is. I have not a clue. Certainly not in Montana. But at any rate, at that point, a general, what was his name, Carrington, stopped them and said, no, you may go no further because of the hostilities ahead of you. Nelson and his group were camped about 3 miles from the fort itself, and they waited for approximately 2 weeks for permission to continue. The permission did not come, and finally Nelson Story got all of his crew together and planned out what they were going to do. And what they basically figured out that 3 miles away from the fort, and if they left in the middle of the night, they could, in fact, the cavalry could no longer catch them. They'd be way too far ahead, which is exactly what they did. They traveled at night for several weeks with no particular problems with the Indians. If any of this sounds familiar, it's the story of Lonesome Dove. And that John B. Catlin was part of that. At any rate, they got to Bozeman, and Nelson Story is credited, I believe, as one of the founders of Bozeman. John B. Catlin and his friend thought that they would continue west. They came through Missoula, discovered the Bitterroot Valley, liked it, thought quite a bit, about maybe they could stay there. Well, but they kind of wanted to see Washington and Oregon, so off they went. A couple of years later, they decided, no, we've done all of this, but the Bitterroot is the best place. So they got their horses and got their stuff together and all of this, ready to come back to Montana. Got all ready to leave, and Catlin's buddy said, no, I've changed my mind, I don't want to go. Well, all right, John B., I think the buddy gave him the horse. So John B. left for Montana by himself with 2 horses. And frankly, in those days, I don't know that was all that unusual. But at any rate, someplace along the line, it was a beautiful sunny afternoon, and there was a lovely meadow, and he decided that, a nap wouldn't be a bad thing to do. So he kind of stabled the horses a little bit and did have a very nice nap. Woke up in the middle of the afternoon, and the horses were gone. Well, he immediately scrambled up to kind of a high spot where he could look out, and he did notice the rump of one of the horses going through the woods. So after the horses he went, and but because he got close enough, he realized that there was a horse thief taking them. So at any rate, he decided he'd work his way around to the front of the horse thief and confront him that way, which he did. And of course, with guns drawn, the horse thief surrendered immediately. So now John has his horses back, and he also has a horse thief. What do you do with a horse thief? Well, some probably would have shot him right then and there, but John was not of that type. So here he goes. He's got the two horses and the horse thief and himself trucking down the road, and eventually they got to another guy that had three horses, one of which not very good. So they all conferred as to what to do with the horse thief, and they finally put him on the horse that wasn't very good and gave him a little bit of food and sent him on his way. Never to be heard from again, I guess. I don't know. Any rate, why, when he got back to the Bitterroot, somehow or other in all of this, he dashed back to Indiana and married his girlfriend and brought her out to Montana. Whereupon they set up shop in Stevensville. He bought the Stevensville Hotel, which was a two-story affair. There were 10 rooms upstairs, rental rooms, as well as the main floor quarters for the Catlins, as well as a large kitchen, a large dining room, and a large living room. And at any rate, this was a reasonably successful venture, and Belle Catlin, John's wife, had a Chinese cook that was doing quite well, other than the fact that the Chinese cook didn't speak very much English. But at any rate, why, Belle Catlin decided that it was probably time for the Chinaman to learn how to build a cake. And so she took the Chinaman into the kitchen and got all the ingredients ready, took him out to the hen house, got the eggs, brought the eggs in, and then she showed the Chinaman basically how you build a cake. Well, the problem was the first egg that she cracked open wasn't any good and she threw it away. So that was how you built a cake. And a few months or so later, she happened to go in the kitchen as the Chinaman was turning out really quite nice cakes, but she happened to notice that he was just starting one. And of course, he took the first egg, threw it away, and then built a hell of a good cake. But at any rate, they were there when Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce came over the Lolo Pass. John had mustered out of the Civil War as a captain, and he, in those days, was, at any rate, the word got out that the Indians were coming and that the civilians and the whites were not going to be spared. It turns out in future history that the Indians wanted no part of the white man and certainly were not interested in burning anything or anything else. But the word, the fear, if you will, was that not only were they going to kill all of the children and women and men and burn everything, but it was going to be just terrible and blah, blah, blah. So what happened is basically the women and children were taken to Fort Missoula, taken to Stevensville, Fort whatever it was there, and elsewhere. And the men, able-bodied, a good share of them, were going to join the cavalry and protect themselves. They hastily created something called Fort Fizzle. Those of you who know about Fort Fizzle, why, at any rate, all Fort Fizzle was a series of log structure wall, if you will, in a good spot up the Lolo Creek where they could confront the Indians and be protected by the log walls. Well, the Indians had a scout out front, as Indians are wont to do, I guess. At any rate, they discovered the fort and went back and simply took another route, went all the way around them. The cavalry and the civilians didn't have a clue. So we avoided that one. From there, the Indians went down the Bitterroot, or up the Bitterroot, whichever way you like it, over into the Big Hole. And there was the Battle of the Big Hole, which is not a terribly pleasant story from the white man's point of view. It basically is a story that the Indians, the cavalry and the volunteers found the encampment, which was across a small creek in a meadow. Up on the hillside on the other side of the creek, the cavalry hid, decided that they would attack at first light, which they were ready to do. But at first light, one of the Indians came out of the teepee checking on horses, immediately discovered the cavalry. The cavalry immediately shot the Indian dead, and all hell broke loose because obviously they were all in their teepees and all of that. And so, but the cavalry and the civilians also had a 4-foot deep stream to cross before they got to the encampment. There was a lot of children and women killed in that raid. I have a rather lengthy description of that battle by John Catlin. Very, very difficult to read because of I think the ink smeared or whatever. But at any rate, he tells them that, look, we did shoot some of the women because they were shooting at us. But at any rate, neither that here nor there. Not a very pleasant part of the history of my great-grandfather or any of the others that were involved. Once Joseph went on, and as you know, he went up the east side attempting to flee into Canada and almost made it. But the life back in the Bitterroot returned to more or less normal, if there was such a thing in those days. And at any rate, John B. continued to run the hotel. He was involved in several other things that you can find in the program. But in later years, John moved and his wife moved back to Missoula. He was good friends with a lot of the very early day pioneers of this area, Judge Woody being one, Edgar Paxson, the artist, another. Paxson and Catlin were good buddies to the point where they spent a lot of time almost every day together, either at Paxson's place or at Catlin's place. Why, you know, Catlin's daughter, Belle, wrote a wonderful narrative of John's life, etc., etc. And she was saying that Catlin would go over to Paxson's studio and critique. And my mother said he had the audacity at this one point to point out to Paxson that this large painting that he was working on would look a lot better if that log that was in the front there, if it had a knothole in it. So Paxson painted the knothole in it. At any rate, the two of them got along famously. And that really is kind of my story as far as John B. Catlin. He was a difficult, tough Indian fighter. And yet, in later years, he, I don't know whether I told you, he was a very staunch Republican in an area of Montana that there weren't many of. And at any rate, he, in later years, he was appointed to be the agent of the Blackfeet Indians. Now, the Blackfeet, I'm sure you know, were one of the fiercest tribes in our whole area. And they were basically based up north of Great Falls in the area which would now be known as Browning, or that general neighborhood. John and his wife went up north of Great Falls. They withstood it for 2 years. How, I don't know. That's pretty desolate country up there. Any rate, they came back to Missoula at that point, and he was appointed the receiver of the U.S. Land Office in Missoula, which he did for a number of years. He finally retired, and interestingly, some of his very best friends were the very Indians that he had fought earlier. And his daughter tells a story of, you could always tell if any of the Indians had paid a visit to John's house or Bill Catlin's house, because the windows would all be open and they were trying to air the place out, because the Indians, of course, smelled like the campfires that were in their teepees, naturally. But at any rate, and likewise, they had a little dog that did not care for Indians, would growl and carry on at great length. One time, an Indian showed up and wanted to see John B. Catlin. Well, John B. Catlin wasn't home. So the Indian said, "I'll wait." Well, mid-morning went to afternoon. John B. still wasn't home. The Indian would not say anything other than a grunt occasionally. Wanted to see John B. Once finally John B. got home in the latter part of the afternoon, the two of them met and the Indian left. Well, his wife wanted to know what was all that about. Well, John said, well, the Indian was broke and he needed to borrow $1 to get home. So at any rate, that's at least while Bill Catlin tells the story, they I don't know, it's kind of hard to put all of this together. Again, I am quite blessed with my family. Both sides of my family have long narratives of their families several generations ago. In this case, it would be John B. Catlin's daughter that wrote all of this stuff. John B. also wrote a very lengthy, like I said, a very lengthy story with regards his take of the Battle of the Big Hole. But, and likewise, I have one from the Coffey side of the family as well, which is kind of fun. You know, when you're young, you don't pay any attention to any of that sort of stuff. Who cares? Well, I put it in a box and eventually put it in a file and so on and so forth, and there it's been. But at any rate, why, I got rooting around a couple of days ago thinking, you know, maybe it might be good to be able to tell a story or two. The factual part of all of this is in your program, and you don't need to be bothered with that by me. And on top of that, I'm liable to not tell the truth anyway. So anyhow, that's kind of the story of John B. Catlin.
I'm representing John Lisseau, who's over there with the apples. Hi there. And he made a fortune in the gold mining business, but he didn't come out here to mine gold. He was hired by John Owen of Fort Owen down here to bring some mining equipment west from Iowa. And so that was way back in the 1860s. And so he led a wagon train led by oxen, pulled by oxen all the way across the overland trail. When they got to Montana, they were attacked by the Sioux warriors who killed 5 of the men, and they lost all their horses, but they still managed to come out here with the oxen and the wagons. And then, so he made it to Fort Owen down there, and then he worked for John Owen for a year. And then he got the bright idea that, hey, the overland trail is kind of like I-90, you know. And you know where that rest area is? They have that new fancy rest area on your way to Drummond on the south side of the road there. That was where his stage station was. And you see, it's still an important stop along the highway. Right? And so he built the stage station, and he ran that, and he figured all the travelers on the Mullen Road. That's where the Mullen Road would cross the river, you know, the Clark Fork River. And so people had to, you know, get on the ferry and move all their stuff. And so that was a really good place to build a trading post. And so that trading post, if you would like to see an authentic, real-life trading post from the 1860s, it still exists, but it's been moved to Rock Creek, and it's Ekstrom's stage station. Restaurant, maybe you stop there. Those are the very logs that this fellow carved out of the hillside back in the 1860s. So while he was running the stage station right here, here's the interstate. This is Garnett, Ghost Town, and Highway 200 would be right about here. So he's running this stage station down here. Meanwhile, Kroger had a successful brewery up here in Beartown. See? There was 5,000 people living in this area around Beartown in the 1860s. And Kroger had been following gold rushes, and he came up Elk Creek over here, and he struck it rich finally. And he invested then in a brewery over here in Beartown.
Which doesn't exist anymore.
Right, and Beartown there's a sign there, but there's nothing really there. Even though there was 5,000 people, they say, living there. What happened to them? They followed the gold rush to the next place, which was Cedar Creek, which is west of here. What happened to their things? They just took them with them. They were really living in tents, you know. And so once they're gone, there's nothing left except not even a forest, because they cut the forest down to build their shacks, you know, and also for the timbers in their mines. So anyway, he has to go down to Deer Lodge to get grain for his brewery, and of course he has to stop at the inn, and probably I bet he sold beer to patrons at the inn. You know what I'm imagining? Anyway, so Kroger talked Lisseau into moving up to Beartown, working with him, and then they started making claims on the gold.
After the miners had left, right? After the rush.
Right. So the big rush was sort of it had moved on. I think in 1869 or so that it had already moved on to Cedar Creek, which is west of here. But these resourceful people stayed behind and actually got gold that the other people had been in too much of a hurry to mine.
Also, there wasn't quite enough water to effectively placer mine at that time, so they could only do so much, and then they ran out of the water, which was the main resource for placer mining. So the advantage that Lisseau had is that he was an engineer, right, by training.
Yeah.
So he was able to engineer a series of reservoirs and locks and ditches that were all graded very carefully to create a hydraulic head that he could use to placer mine. And so they were able to get more out of the placer than those that had come before.
Yeah. So then they,
And they exploited Chinese labor to do it.
yeah, you can find evidence of all this when you read the documents. But anyway, so they would go then down to Deer Lodge to get their supplies, and that was a farming community, so they could get grain, so they could make their beer, right? And so they go there, and of course, you know who the leading citizen of Deer Lodge was? Conrad Coors, who was the cattle king of Montana, and he was very wealthy. He was selling cattle to the miners down in southwest Montana. And so he's very wealthy, and so he hires 2 more people from Holstein. They're all from Holstein, Germany. They come all the way from Holstein, and it's 2 women, and one of them is buried right over there. That's Dora. So Dora married John Lisseau, and they had 3 children who are buried right there. And her sister Anna married Kroger, and they had 4 children, and so they raised them all in Beartown. But at that time, then there was probably only like 100 people left in Beartown. So they spent 20 years making a living in Beartown. In fact, Lisseau was a postmaster in Beartown. Then the railroad came in, and that meant you could ship heavy equipment in to Montana. So if you wanted to have an underground mine, you know, where you're mining out quartz veins and such to get the gold out of it, you have to have, you know, you have to have hoists, you have to have steam things, you have to have all kinds of heavy equipment, and a mill. They had to have a ball mill for crushing the rock to get the gold out of it. So that actually cost a huge amount of capital to get all of that. Plus, you had to get all the equipment up there. Up till then, it was just a horse trail up through this canyon. If you've been through there, you know how narrow that canyon is. Going up from the highway to Garnett. But they actually built a wagon road so they could move this heavy equipment up, and then they could have underground mines. See? So these guys sold their patented claim to Muzzingbrod and his partner so they could do the underground mining, and they made enough money on the sale to move to, so John moved to Missoula, and we're standing on his property right here. His land went from here all the way to the interstate and all the way over to Grant Creek that way, and all the way over to those gravel pits that way. And his partner Kroger moved his family down to Phillipsburg and started a brewery that was very, very successful. And then their children were into aviation, right? Isn't that right? Kroger's 2 boys got into aviation. That's what I heard.
Okay, could be. They were in California.
So you know, I was researching this, and you read all newspaper articles, and you read this and that and stuff. So the reason this was part of Lisseau's property is he sold this for $1 to Missoula County so they could expand their cemetery.
And then Lisseau had other partners because he was a successful businessman, right?
Right.
So he made partnerships with these guys here, which are, this is me, Frenchman.
Here I am, Elvers. I was a lonely bachelor all my life.
And an odd fellow,
Yeah, odd fellow.
literally and figuratively. But we didn't have as much success with the mines as Lisseau and his partner Kroger. So Lisseau sponsored our house in Missoula.
Which was actually up the Rattlesnake, right?
Yep.
They had a little place. These 2 partners Elfers and Apel. Yeah, lived together until they died in that little house of the rattlesnakes.
Yep.
And so the reason the stones are identical, can you tell them that?
So that when I made the little quip about Oddfellows, the International Order of Oddfellows is something kind of like a Masonic order. I don't think they're actually Masonic, are they?
No.
But
It's a four-man's Masonic.
yeah, they're sort of.
Well, you could say that. My grandfather was an odd fellow.
Really? No, I read that.
Well,
You didn't have to be
before
rich.
ma- Well,
to, yeah.
okay. We can talk about that.
Well, the stones represent their membership in the Oddfellows fraternal organization, and we're actually paid for by the Oddfellows also, because they were poor Oddfellows, but they were not that all Oddfellows are poor. Yes. For instance, Lisseau was not.
Yeah, he was also an odd fellow.
And also Kroger was an Oddfellow. Right.
And so was Coors.
So there were some
Oddfellows had a very
rich
strong fellowship here.
Yeah, there's an Oddfellows organization in Missoula to this day. Where's their temple? Oddfellows.
I don't know. Do you know?
No.
Google it.
My grandfather was in Chicago, but I don't think,
Oh.
I don't think that's the name.
Yeah. They had a big thing over in Helena. I know it's a wonderful organization. They help a lot of people. Don't they help orphans and such? Isn't that one of the things they try to do?
Probably. They play cards a lot.
You talk about the brewery and such in the 1860s.
Yeah.
Was there any effect out this far west of the Civil War?
Actually, a lot of the miners were displaced Southerners.
As in avoiding the war?
No, had lost their families or their.
Yeah.
After the war. After
Right.
the war.
But actually, I think a lot of the, gold was first struck down in southwest Montana in 1862 during the war. And there was like 10,000 people descended on Bannock and Virginia City. And as I understand it, Abraham Lincoln needed that gold to supply the Union with equipment from Europe. And so actually Montana was a very strategic part of the Yankees campaign to win the war. And so in fact he had allowed that Mullen Trail to be developed as a wagon road, so that that cut 400 miles off of the route to the gold fields of Montana. But that eventually led to Custer's Last Stand, because they broke several treaties, and that area was the best hunting grounds of several of the tribes that later came together.
But they broke the treaties because in the desperation of the war effort, they just overlooked the treaties.
Well, it was after the war. It was like they broke the treaties twice. First time they broke it, there was the Fort Fetterman massacre, and then they actually shut the trail down. Grant, that was after the war. Grant shut down the trail because it was too expensive to protect travelers on the trail and keep all those garrisons going. But then in the 1870s, then the trail reopened, and that's when they were breaking treaties, and that led to Custer's Last Stand in 1876. Yeah.
But then there were the soldiers from the Civil War were the miners, and that part of why the gold rushes were so such a boom and bust cycle is that they weren't educated on being miners. They came and they were seeking their fortunes and all, but they were just following the rush. Whereas engineers like Lisseau had a lot of training in what it actually takes to extract minerals from the earth, and so they were able to come in the wake of these booms and clean up what had been that had been left behind by inexperienced.
And also, of course, they raised families, so they were much more settled than rushing off with your tent to the next
Claim.
gold claim. Yep.
And often they wouldn't even come out of their claim like any richer than they were when they got there. They just
They'd
Yeah.
spend
would
it all.
just spend it all and then go on to the next.
And it's the same with precarious labor in our current age. You have a boom of some sort and people rush in and make money, but they're exploited by the sort of capitalists that happen to be running those operations, and then so the labor force ends up no better off than they started. In fact, probably worse off in general.
So Lisseau wound up as the vice president of the main bank in Missoula after he sold that mine for enough money to buy all this property we're standing on, but also to invest in that mine, in that bank. So he was the principal shareholder of Western Montana National Bank there, and that's that big building. It's on the corner of
The granite
Higgins and Front, not Front,
Main.
Sterling.
Main.
Sterling.
Higgins and Broadway. It's the tall building there where Teddy Roosevelt came to give a speech. So he wound up being a vice president of that bank and the principal shareholder. Whereas, and then Kroger invested his money in a big brewery down in Phillipsburg.
Is that the same brewery in Seaburg that's operation now?
Well, that's something I don't know for sure, but I think it shut down in the
Prohibition.
Prohibition, and I don't really know exactly what happened after that. So, anything else?
good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
you're welcome. Yeah, right. Yeah.